making the case for funding digital government. My name is Grahame Rivers, and I'll be the moderator and host for this panel. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek. This is a quote from my friend Zina Abdullah, who was a driver of digital government in Ontario when it was run out of a closet. Government isn't risk-averse, it's change-averse, and in fact, it's willing to take on risk in order not to change. And we've seen this through a number of huge technology failures. Government, even when signs are pointing to things going wrong, government maintains its course because change is hard. And accepting that the pace of digital change is as slow as it's going to be right now, it's only as slow as it's going to be right now, the need to make that case in government is paramount. And so we need to find a way to effectively make the case to change government in order to fund changes to the way we work, the way we deliver for citizens, and how we govern ourselves. And so without any further ado, I'm going to ask our panelists to come up so that they can make their presentations. So if you could come to the stage, panelists. Yes, please. And then I'll introduce each of you. So, sorry? Yes, yes. Jaimie Boyd, hello, she serves as the Chief Digital Officer for the Government of British Columbia. She leads work to embrace digital change, helping government better serve citizens using modern technologies. She previously held positions with the Government of Canada and the private sector. In 2009, Apolitical listed her among the world's 100 most influential people in digital government. A friend of mine and someone who helped bring me to the federal government in Ottawa, Ryan Androsoff. Ryan is an international expert on digital government and an enthusiastic advocate for the use of digital technology and user-centered design approaches. Ryan has 2 decades of experience working with government and international organizations in Canada, the United States, and Europe. Ryan currently has partnered with the Institute on Governance to lead their Digital Executive Leadership Program for public sector executives. Previously, Ryan was a co-founder of the Canadian Digital Service. Jenna Sudds. Jenna is Ottawa City Councillor and is a fierce advocate for communities and is passionate about civic tech. She's a trained economist, practiced as a business leader. She thrives at the intersection of technology, government, and people, and enjoys cracking the puzzle of how best this trio works. And Katy Lalonde, Director at the Ontario Digital Service. Woo! Katy is a founding member of the Ontario Digital Service. She played a lead role in building the ODS and shaping its evolution as it moved across different ministries and through multiple government mandates. Katy has extensive experience in digital strategy, in navigating and shifting the machinery of government, in leadership and in operations of digital organizations, and organizational design to support empowered multidisciplinary teams. So welcome. And with that, I'm going to invite Jaimie to give her presentation.
I thought he was going to be like my applause and cheering machine. That would have been really cool. Can you hear me better now? No? No? Should I really enunciate? All right. So good morning, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My name's Jaimie. I'm in from Victoria, and it's a lot of fun. I've been in my role for about 6 months, and I spent the previous 8 years in the belly of the beast over in Ottawa, and it's kind of interesting to get to come back and speak with all of you folks, because BC is, physically it's very far, but existentially sometimes we're a little bit far west too. So it's nice to get to see what's going on here. So the topic that we have before us, making the case for funding, I think we can answer this in two kinds of ways. We've got sort of the micro level for individual projects and the macro level. I'm going to focus on the macro level today. There are lots of things that we can be doing around making the case for funding specific individual digital projects, and that's a really important conversation. I'm not going to drill into that too much. We've got some work underway there. Happy to talk about it afterwards, but I'm going to try to focus on making the high-level case for why governments should become digital and why we should be collectively choosing to invest in this work. I want to recognize that there are a few people at this conference who are super knowledgeable, and I've only been at this in BC for 6 months. So I see JP in the back, who is I would say a founder of a lot of our digital work in BC. We've got Kelsey Singbell, who's from our design team. She's not in the room right now, but she's around. Andrea, I see you in the front row. So another leader from BC in a lot of the digital change thinking and inclusion and whatnot. So I'll get started. Again, I would really welcome any feedback, comments, rude remarks, whatever at the end. Hopefully not too much chirping during, right? Anyway, off we go. So I feel like I need to say this, and I'll say it 1,000 times. Technology has truly changed the world. Like we've got IoT, robotics, AI, all these things. And with that comes a new imperative that I think that we're increasingly attuned to in the public sector. I know for a lot of you have at least had a stint in the public sector, so this is not a message that I need to push on too much, but I think it's worth saying again and again and just really emphasizing it, because technology has changed the world. It's also changing government, largely because it's forcing us to look at new imperatives, right? So you've got citizens who are able to look, on their one hand, they can skip the dishes, they can hail rides and all that, and on the other hand, if we're lucky, we're talking about mainframes, right? And so it's really a real struggle to deal with this mismatch. And I would argue that when we continue to have these paper-based processes, these fax machines that are helping us spread data on coronavirus, when we have all these bizarro processes, over time, we're starting to look at a bit of a trust deficit, right? And so you look at the data, the Edelman Trust Barometer, our societies have never been more polarized. Levels of trust in public institutions are really quite problematic. And we see that not just in the global data, we see it within Canada, right? So this is 2018 data from Ipsos. They went out and polled Canadians. They said, hey, what do you think? Are government policies ready? No, just plain no, right? And I think that we've seen this time and time again. I think that there have been lots of efforts to update some of our policy instruments, but you're increasingly seeing governments say, well, I don't understand this, let's ban it. Like, oh, that seems like a bit of a blunt instrument. So we really do have to be cautious when it comes to these things. We also have to think about the views of the people we're trying to serve, right? So again, this is the same Ipsos poll, 2018. They went out and they said, hey, what do you think about AI? And it ends up that if you look down, and I'm sorry that this is so tiny and fuzzy, but essentially, if you're doing things like using AI to supplement really bureaucratic processes, so like robotic process automation, all that sort of thing, people are generally okay with it. But then you get down into, hey, how do you feel about using AI to help inform healthcare decisions? That's a big ol' hell no in Canada right now. And so we do have to be thoughtful about the views of the people that we're trying to serve when it comes to deploying technology. So in that context, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, in BC, we are pretty assertively embracing digital change. We've been doing it for a long time, and I do want to really show, express a lot of enthusiasm for some of the great work that's come before. And I would say right now we're going through a big process of trying to accelerate these things through our digital framework, our new digital principles, creation of my role, all that sort of thing. So when it comes time to make the case for why we should be collectively investing in digital government, I would say I can make the argument in three big kinds of ways. One, I can use logic. That sometimes works. Two, I can tell stories. That often works. And then three, I can show that better is possible and therefore better is necessary. So I'm going to try to walk you through these three sort of categories of arguments. And I think that they're also in sort of level of utility. So the first one is logic. We know that digital government really does provide lots of great benefits. So for me in BC, I work for, it's a left-wing government, it's an NDP Green coalition, and holy smokes, the emphasis on public services is huge. You look at our speech from the throne, you look at our budget that came out 3 weeks ago, we're looking at a level of commitment to service delivery that's incredible, right? And so in the internet age, fourth industrial revolution, how you're gonna provide services without digital tools is beyond me. So we really hang our hat on that idea of providing services. So digital government matters because of service excellence. It also matters because of the efficiencies, right? And so really managing our data appropriately. I was mentioning our Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Relief has this awesome robotic process automation initiative where they are freeing up public servants so that they can focus on serving the humans. Right? Why not automate the things that are sort of lower value bureaucratic processes so that the humans can really focus on the really high value, high touch type initiatives, right? So good opportunities for efficiency. And then over time, when we provide service excellence, when we do so in a way that shows respect for the public dime, over time, I would argue that there is an argument to be made around trust and really rebuilding the relationship between the people and the state and ultimately reinforcing our democracy. So that's one way of arguing for the case to fund digital. Far more interesting case is around telling stories. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the digital initiatives. These are totally anecdotal. There are lots more, but I do want to tell you a few stories from BC that I'm really excited about. So these are some of the people on the team. They're in the BC Developers Exchange in the lab. So you've got Aaron and Ari, and these are the people doing the real work, and I'm just taking credit for it. It's fantastic. It's fun to be a Chief Digital Officer. And so they are working in this really wonderful creative space. It's in downtown Victoria, where we support teams. We have up to 12 teams working at any given time. They're fully agile. It's a lot of fun. They're shipping product very regularly. And I want to tell you about one of the stories that I learned about when I first joined the organization that just blew me away. So BC, it's largely, there's a lot of resource development. We do have a very resource-based economy, and we had a major crisis in 2014. We had a major mine site where the tailing pond ruptured and poisoned the water source for one of our communities. And then about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago, a mine inspector showed up, Aaron, and he said, I'm having trouble delivering my regulatory functions. So he's flying around BC, trying to find the mines that he's supposed to inspect, and not necessarily taking a risk-based approach, right? He's inspecting these mines that have just been inspected, and then occasionally he's finding ones where it's like, somebody should have been here a while ago. And the reason for that was disparate, non-integrated information. And so the Mines Digital Service came out of our Ministry of Energy, Mines and Petroleum Resources as an effort to consolidate a bunch of disparate data sets and then create a dashboard that allowed regulators like Aaron to actually take that risk-based approach. So not the most, it's not rocket science, but it is truly changing the way we conduct our regulatory function and keeping British Columbians safer. So pretty good one. Another one that I just have to tell you about because I think everybody in Canada should have one of these, BC Services Card. So it's an integrated piece of identification. We're the first jurisdiction in North America to take our driver's license and our health card and integrate them. So the back office piece of that is not too complicated. It means we can onboard lots of different services. So one of the things that we can do is now create a digital twin. So we can download an app and you can have all sorts of different services. So this is, here's me. With my app, waiting for the service agent. There's me talking to the guy. He asked me my name, so two-factor authentication. He verifies that that's truly me. And then here's my online version of my BC Services Card. And I can now go and access all sorts of services like our health gateway, student loans, that sort of thing. And as of 2 weeks ago, I can also use it to validate my identity to file my taxes federally. So we're starting to talk about government as a platform. Pretty exciting stuff. Almost out of time, so I'm just going to leave it with a couple of that third bucket of argument, and that is that better is possible and therefore better is necessary. Our digital framework is based on a bunch of different pillars, so services. Governments exist to serve people. Let's remind ourselves that again and again. To support that service delivery, we've got data information, upskilling ourselves, becoming digital inside, and really reinforcing our connection to communities. We have new digital principles. The last one is one that I'm very excited about. We're the first jurisdiction in the world to take the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and we've put it into legislation. So, you know, if we're going to do digital, we better do it with a reconciliation lens. I'll leave it there. I was going to tell you about all the different habits that I think are conducive to success in this space, but really, governments can do better, and it's people like those here in the room today that can help deliver on that potential. So if you build a digital service, and you should, make it open and it makes it better. That means I can use it. And I'm really excited to collaborate with all of you going forward. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Next up is Ryan Androsoff.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm gonna talk for a few minutes around what I think are some of the tactical considerations for any of you who are gonna be going out and trying to make the case to get resources for what you wanna do in the digital space. You know, my assumption is that everybody in this room is a believer, right? You're here because, you know, you understand the power of some of what Jaimie was talking about in terms of what digital can do. You understand that technology is changing the world, but the reality is that not everybody in the institutions you work with and within have caught up to that. And I think part of the real magic behind this is how do we make some of the changes we're trying to see in terms of civic tech, in terms of digital within government, sustainable in the long run. And I've had the pleasure in my career to work on a number of different initiatives that I kind of consider startups within government or public sector entrepreneurship. For those who are in the federal government, you might be familiar with the GCpedia, GC Connects tool set, and I had managed that team for a while as it was trying to grow and scale within government. And as Graham mentioned, I also had the chance to be part of the team that launched the Canadian Digital Service about 3 years ago. And I want to talk about the creation of CDS for a couple of minutes and then some lessons from both CDS and my other experience that lead to this. So when the idea for CDS was first starting to percolate in a real way was back in 2016. And at that time, the Ontario digital team was just starting its journey. We had seen examples from around the world, from GDS in the United Kingdom, from 18F in the US Digital Service in the US and elsewhere, where this notion of building central digital teams as part of the driver of the digital changes that we're trying to see happen were becoming part of the landscape. And with a new government having come in federally, not that long before that, there was a real impetus to say, can we do things differently and how do we supercharge that? But the reality was this, that for us to be able to make that real, we needed resources, we needed support, we needed to be able to build something. And even though people like myself, I think, had the sense of that vision on what we wanted to do, we had to bring others along on that journey. And the reality is that there are no magic wands that you can wave that are going to simply make this happen because it's a good idea, right? You've got to have a strategy to be able to get there. And so part of how we started that journey was literally starting a journey. We did cross-country consultations in the fall of 2016 into early 2017. I know there's folks here at the conference today who we visited as part of that. And part of this was not so much because we didn't necessarily know where we were going on this, but it was about building a coalition and building momentum. And it was about getting allies and people like our friends at the Ontario Digital Service and others who were starting on this as well, who could help be those third-party verifiers for us as we were making the case for building something new like CDS. Because ultimately, all the work that we were doing publicly in terms of consultations and engagement were there to support a separate tracker process that was going on more behind closed doors, which was making the case for budget funding. Because one of the realities, and I'll mention this again in a minute, is that unless you can get funding and people behind your idea, it's not a real thing, right? We have traditionally done a lot of digital in the corner of people's desks. And I was at a point, 4 years ago where I was tired of that happening. And I wanted to see us build an organization where this was their mission, this was their full-time job. But the reality means you've got to navigate the budgeting process to be able to actually get there. And so all of this was really working up towards that moment that came, 6 months later in March of 2017 when we got to the budget. And we actually got that announcement that said, yes, We've got money in the budget. We've got a 3-year runway for the Canadian Digital Service to become a real thing. And that was a huge moment for us because all of the work that we had been doing to build momentum, to make the case, to sell it to politicians, to senior officials in government, to build that coalition, was really working up to that moment. Now, for those of you, who are in government, you know that the budget decision is the beginning of another set of processes, not the end of it. And there were still months left of Treasury Board submissions, the memorandum to Cabinet, and all of the internal machinations that have to go on to create a thing. But within relatively short order, in a few months, the Canadian Digital Service existed, right? It launched in July of 2017, and by government terms, to have that kind of turnaround in less than a year from idea to execution is actually remarkably fast. But one of the important things to kind of consider behind this, though, and I think we always drove hard to be able to get CDS to exist as fast as possible, was taking inspiration from what our friends in the UK often talk about, is their notion that the strategy is delivery, right? And the theory behind CDS always was that it wasn't going to necessarily have its whole 3-year journey mapped out, right? It wasn't going to know ahead of time what all of the deliverables are going to be and what all the metrics of success were going to be down the road. Because the reality is, in this kind of world, I think it's unrealistic to know that ahead of time. And it's challenging because all of our budgeting and funding processes are predicated upon this idea that you got this master plan, right? And I think, as most of you in this room know, particularly in this world of fast-paced digital change, the master plans ain't worth the paper they're written on, right? And so part of our theory of the change of the case behind CDS was that we would get started early and deliver things and use that delivery to build momentum onto our success, right? Our slight variation on it was do the thing first, right? And then talk about it afterwards. And that's what really drove us behind it. But importantly, I think, to realize on this is that getting going is only half the battle, right? It was thrilling to have CDS go from what was an idea and a vision to having, people in an office actually starting to work on things. But there is a big difference between launching innovation and scaling innovation in government. This is a graph I often like to use because I think it gets an important concept across. So this is a mashup of the Gartner Hype Cycle for New Technology and Geoffrey Moore's work around the adaptation of new technology. And both of them have this concept of, Gartner calls it the trough of disillusionment, Geoffrey Moore calls it the chasm. But it's this notion that the approach to start new innovation and to get it going is different than what it takes to scale it up. And I think actually government isn't bad at doing innovation. We see lots of innovation labs and innovative pilots that pop up when you have the right conditions in place. What government is really bad at is scaling innovation and making it sustainable. And so one of the pieces of advice I want to leave you with is you need to think about, if you're embarking on a new initiative, not just how do you get it going, but what does the scaling of it look like? And often the approaches and the methods and the people who are going to be best suited to launching innovation are not going to be the same approaches and methods and people who are going to be best at scaling it. And so you got to think about what that pivot looks like down the road. So a couple of closing thoughts in terms of tactics and approaches, in terms of what you need to be thinking about to be successful in making this pitch. So the first one is you've got to clarify your vision, right? And I think this seems like a no-brainer, but I think there are a lot of people who plunge in to trying to launch new initiatives without answering that question of what problem are you trying to solve. And I think it's really important that you've got clarity on what that is, and also, to be frank, to be open to that changing. Because part of doing a good user-driven iterative process is that you may discover that the initial problem you thought you were trying to solve isn't the one you eventually get to. Secondly, we talk a lot about getting to yes, and that's obviously incredibly important, right? Anything around trying to make the case for funding in government is about ultimately getting to yes. But before you can do that, you've got to clarify what yes is, right? Because in government, we often suffer from a plethora of people who want to approve things, right? And I kind of think about this as like, what's your minimal viable approval process, right? Like, what does yes actually be, and who do you actually need to say yes to something versus people who just have an opinion on it, right? So clarifying that. Third, the way that government as an organism expresses that something is important is through budget and FTEs, right? That is how government decides, its allocation of resources to what's important. And so I do think, as much as there is a ton that can be done through community and collaboration, ultimately for sustainability, you've got to be thinking about how do you get funding and people in place to be able to scale your initiative. And then as part of that, as I mentioned, is about building momentum in a coalition, right? Ultimately, governments are large, complex organisms, and you've got to be able to assemble that coalition of people that's going to get you to your end goal at the end of it. And my last of these, and perhaps the most important of these, is, that advice from Star Wars, stay on target. It is... the life of anybody, and most of you who've lived in government will have experienced this, you've got a million different pressures coming at you, you've got a million different folks who have agendas of their own, and you've got to be constantly thinking about how do you move your piece of the chessboard forward. When we were in the process of getting CDS off the ground, every time something was coming into me, my one and only question was, is doing this going to help us get closer to our goal of creating CDS? And if it wasn't, then it had to get parked until we got to that point. And so I think a relentless focus on what you're trying to get accomplished and really understanding what you have to do to get to yes is important behind this. One last thought before Grahame pulls me off the stage. So we talk a lot about strategy. So governments are very good at wanting to have big strategies behind things. And I think having a strategy is important, right? It is important for us to have kind of a sense of where we're going to go. Now, the old adage is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that is 100% true. You can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if you're not thinking about the culture of your organization, it'll put it to the side. But I would argue that incentives eat culture and structure eat everything else, right? And what I think is really important for you to be thinking about is when you're making a case to fund digital government or to fund a new initiative, great that you have a strategy, but you've got to be thinking about the culture and the incentives and the structures of your organization, because if your approach to funding doesn't take into account all of those, it's ultimately likely not to be successful. So you really need to have that broad ecosystem approach to all of it. So a few thoughts on tactics on this, and look forward to discussing more in the Q&A. Thank you.
So next, I would like to invite up Jenna Sudds.
Thank you very much. There we go. Okay. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name's Jenna Sudds, and I have the pleasure of being an elected official. I'm going to guess there's not a ton of us here in the room today, but it's great to be here, and I think it's important to include our elected officials at every level as part of these discussions. You may think of me as a politician. I think of myself as a community builder. That's why I got into this space, and I think that's probably what many of yourselves think of yourselves as well. So we're really not that different, but I have now the privilege of being at the table to make political decisions, to be empowered to help move agendas forward at that political table, which comes with its challenges, but also comes with immense responsibility and benefits. So quick rundown of what I wanted to do with you a bit today. My goal was to walk you through a real life example in Ottawa. So talk about that strategy, and then from that strategy, some examples of projects that have resulted from this strategy, and key lessons that I think will be useful to yourself moving forward. Some of those tricks as to how to successfully make the case for funding. Myself, very quickly, previous to this role, I used to run something called the CIO Strategy Council, which is doing some great work here in the country. Prior to that, I ran our business association that represents the tech park in Ottawa, the Canada North Technology Park. I also sit on the board. I know Andy Best is in the room for Open City Network.
which is doing some fantastic work, and I encourage you to take a look at that as well. So I'm going to start now with kind of that strategy that got a particular department in Ottawa to where it is today. I'm talking about our Transportation Services Department, interestingly enough. Not necessarily what you'd think of right away when you think about digital and when you think about change happening within a city. However, it all started with a goal. And this department in particular decided that they wanted to be at the forefront of technology and research, to be proactive and not reactive to change. Their vision really was to provide residents and visitors in the nation's capital, Ottawa, with sustainable, state-of-the-art transportation management and traveler information systems that supply safe, reliable, and accurate information. And I hope no one will make any LRT jokes to me. I'm not in Ottawa, so hopefully that hasn't reached Toronto, but we're not going to talk about that today. So the challenge was then, how do we achieve this? And that, of course, is the hard part. How does the team, one of many departments within a large bureaucracy in the city, how do they move forward and sell this vision? Because that's what they ultimately needed to do. So this is where the hard work really started. And it was the development of that strategy. And that strategy, as you can see on the screen, was developed in 2012. And it really was the anchor of how we got to where we are today. Has it evolved? Absolutely. But it was those building blocks that enabled the department to move forward. So the strategy itself, as I said, it's from the strategy evolved, of course, to an action plan. And it was looking at a 10 to 15-year horizon. It took a very citizen-centered approach while adopting the concept of smart city, which again, thinking back to 2012, was still a fairly new concept at the time. It ensured that the strategy ensured that initiatives would always have end users in mind, be it pedestrians, cyclists, transit users, motorists, or tourists to our city, and ensured that information and outcomes for residents and users were sustainable, with a very high level of customer service as the goal. The emphasis of the strategy was advanced traffic management, traveler information system, and best practices. This is a bit of a visual of those components of the strategy. I won't drill down too much into it. And key to this, as I'm sure you can all appreciate, and a vantage point that, of course, I'm bringing here is how did they move this forward? How did they make the case for digital for funding to move this forward? I liked the comment earlier by Ryan. FTEs and dollars are really the indicator of being able to move forward. And ultimately, in this case, the strategy was presented at council. It was consulted extensively prior to, be that with stakeholders, be that with councillors as well. And the department itself had a track record, a demonstrated track record of efficiencies that planted the seeds and really served them well as they were looking to move this forward. And interestingly enough, ever since that point in time, connected vehicles then became a term of council priority in our last term and in our current term. So a couple examples that then resulted in the last few years as a result of this strategy moving forward. A few highlights: our LED streetlight conversion program. As you can appreciate, in the city the size of Ottawa, we now have 80% of our streetlights converted to LED. Interestingly enough, this also comes with real-time monitoring and management of these LED lighting systems. You can appreciate the possibilities that that is now creating moving forward. Thinking from an open data perspective, the capabilities that we now have moving forward are really quite astounding. We also have an adaptive traffic control project that's rolled out and is now in phase 3. This adaptive traffic control project, essentially normally traffic signals are set up based on their own loop of information. But the project group has now grouped traffic signals together. In essence, being able to identify that traffic is on its way, creating better efficiencies and flow of traffic. Again, a small example in which you can appreciate rolling forward has the potential for some massive impacts on how we move around in our cities. EcoDrive is another really interesting project that initiated out of this strategy. It's a partnership with Transport Canada, MTO, the city, of course, and Carleton University. These partnerships, I think it's important to mention, because without partnerships, in large part, it is very hard to move forward with such complex projects at any scale. So just echoing the importance of developing those relationships. Also really interesting work happening on our Ottawa L5 private test track. This test track, I think it's the only reason that I'm happy that Ottawa has such a terrible winter, because we now have this phenomenal facility that's now renowned for winter weather testing for autonomous vehicles, as well as smart agriculture and other applications. We have a 16-kilometer track, gated trackway, that is now enabling dozens of different opportunities for testing in a safe and controlled environment. It's really fun if you ever get to see it in Ottawa. It's really set up like a little city. Railway crossing, crosswalks, stop signs, lights, you name it. And also near and dear to my heart, we also have there's a map here of an on-road test bed for autonomous vehicles in our Canada North Technology Park. Another great example of how government partnering with other organizations can really push forward on these types of initiatives. So I'm out of time, but very quickly, lessons learned. So getting support politically, be that at the city level, provincial level, or federal level, is so key when pursuing these projects, and again, hopefully translating to FTEs and funding. The infrastructure to support innovation, obviously required. Fostering partnerships with government, industry, and pilot projects to create tangible impacts, such as enhanced safety and mobility. I think it's important as I close to note, as a municipality, and I think that's safe to say across the country, municipalities have extensive experience building physical infrastructure, the physical parts of our city. And traditionally, the province and the federal government have extensive regulations and policies and funding opportunities. But municipal operations increasingly require new digital infrastructure where the rules are less clear. And I think where we have less understanding of the implications of what we might actually be giving away in the process. I think our cities face a very real risk that a small number of vendors could control our smart city infrastructure. And this is really a pressing issue that deserves our attention. And I believe we must move forward being very mindful of this risk and weighing our options. Lastly, a thought to leave you with, that technology for the public realm should be built with and for users. I think that's why we are all here today with that in mind, built on strong public policy and governance foundations. And we all have to collaborate to get there. Thank you very much.
I'm going to invite up Katy Lalonde.
I'm very short, so I'll lower this a little bit. Hi, I'm Katy. I work for the Ontario Digital Service. And what I want to talk today a little bit about is how to use government machinery to your advantage and to take advantage of government machinery in order to get project-specific funding. I think we've heard a lot of really great information today about kind of how to build the business case for digital, and so I'm going to try and make this super tactical and build on the points that everyone else has made. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Ontario Digital Service, we are an organization at the center of government. Our mission is to drive digital transformation across government, and we act as kind of a center of gravity. A core piece of this is delivery. We are a delivery organization. We run the government's, the back end of the government's website, ontario.ca, but we also partner with ministries in order to deliver digital projects and show them the digital way of working and how it can be different. A key piece of this is kind of shown through our funding model. So I want to set a little bit of context around how we're funded before diving into our specific focus today. And so the vast majority of our funding comes from base funding. That's about 73% of how we're funded. But those digital services organizations out there know that you cannot survive on this alone. There's so much to do, you will run out of it very quickly. And so you have to find different ways to kind of beg, borrow, and steal where you can get it. We've managed to do that through a few different ways. Obviously, we do operate on a small recovery model specifically around ontario.ca, and that makes up about 15% of our, 15% of our funding. And then the last 12% is through project-specific funding, which is what I want to talk about today. Specifically, one of the programs that we were able to launch, which is around the top 10 transactions at Service Ontario. And so we are a couple of years into the mandate of a new government. And when the new government came in, they set some really clear goals about what they wanted to do and the impact they wanted to make. Namely around how can we put people at the center of everything we do and how can government operate efficiently and effectively. And for those in the digital space, this is like music to our ears, right? Like people at the center of what we do is what we do. And so we at the ODS really understood that this was an opportunity for us to take advantage of the types of things this government wanted to do in order to accelerate digital transformation. And so one of the programs that we were able to get off the ground through the first budget cycle that they ran was this top 10 transactions program. And so what it is essentially the goal is to drive greater adoption of digital services to our top services by moving approximately 10 million in-person services from Service Ontario online over the next 5 years. And so a pretty ambitious goal, but we wanted to focus on these transactions because they are one of the primary ways that people interact with the province. If you are from Ontario, you have been to a Service Ontario, you have probably had varying experience with it, you've renewed your driver's license, your health card, all of these things. And so we knew this was a really high-touch transaction, and there was a huge opportunity in this space. Of those top 10 transactions, largely, they're almost all around the health and driver's license or driver's or vehicle renewal, things like your license plate sticker, those kinds of things. Some of those services aren't online at all. And the ones that are online, we're hovering kind of between 15 and 30% online adoption. So there's a huge opportunity there to move it up to something like 65% adoption. It is a big collaboration project as well. It is an opportunity for us to work horizontally, and so there's plus or minus 4 ministries involved depending on how government has changed and shuffled where they are. So it's Ministry of Health, Ministry of Transportation, Government and Consumer Services, which is where Service Ontario is, and of course the Ontario Digital Service. We have 7 product teams working on this already. It does kind of change depending on whether a team has a policy blocker and we move a few people to other teams and where we're at with funding and partner resources. But importantly with this is that we are focused on these top 10 transactions, but we're also using this as a way to build our government as a platform approach. So as well as focusing on specific transactions, we have teams working on things things like a notification platform and working on a design system. So we've been able to use this program and the funding we got for that in order to advance our broader digital government roles as well. And so as you identify these opportunities within your own space, think about how you can use them as an advantage to drive other causes as well. So it will be good for this project and then good for many of our other projects as we move along. So how did we get started? So we use government machinery to our advantage, which I know in the digital space is something you tend to just like run away from. And as soon as you see a form or a template or a governance process, it is easy to be like, not for us. We'll just figure it out on our own. But I want to encourage you to think about how you can use those processes. So we actually use the budget process. There was a call for submissions, and they were just looking for ideas. Ideas for how we can drive efficiencies, ideas for how we can improve services. And we thought, you know what, we know exactly how to do this. And so we actually followed the Treasury Board process and worked with our partner in Service Ontario to scope what that project could look like. We saw a huge opportunity in this space. At the time, we shared a deputy. The Chief Digital and Data Officer was also the Deputy Minister for Consumer Services, and so Service Ontario was in our portfolio. And we really saw this as an opportunity to meet the government, what the government was looking to do with the services that we provide. And so my first big lesson is like, look for those government process, look for those opportunities where they're trying to find big, bold ideas, and don't be afraid to put yourself out there and say like, you know what we have can meet what your needs are, and use those to your advantage. There are, of course, drawbacks for being part of the machinery of government, especially if you're going through Treasury Board processes. It usually means you're going to get stuck in like a reporting nightmare of having to report back on your progress every 5 minutes. But sometimes it is worth the trade-off because you do get money and people out of it. Finding the right idea. So for us, we knew that it had to be something that was very retail focused, that it was something that would really respond to that mission that the government had put forward to put people at the center of what we do. We also knew that it had to be ambitious. Like, we wanted to push ourselves to do better. And so working kind of on some reports and some studies that had been done within the ministry around Service Ontario, we landed on this idea of top 10 transactions. One, because it sounds great. Top 10 seems really manageable. 65%, 10 million transactions. It has like a really great story behind it. But also because we knew we could do it. We knew that the space was fertile for it. People want online transactions. They had a strong service design team in the ministry that was working in this way and trying to make progress, so we knew we had good partners. And so we were able to really focus in on what that idea was and what the scope was, while still not being afraid to be ambitious and set like a really far out target for ourselves, knowing that it would be slow to get there and that we weren't going to see like, you can't drive 10 million transactions online tomorrow. That's just not going to happen. But you can set the goal to get there and how we can work towards it. And I think all of the speakers so far have talked to this last point, which is tell the story. And tell the story not from like the digital government perspective, but tell the story from the perspective of the people who you are trying to get that money from. And so use to your advantage the similarities between your narrative and what your goals are and what you're working towards in order to tell the story for the people that are approving your funding. And don't be afraid to speak in their language and use their terms, because it will ultimately help you get the funding that you need and align around the same common goals. So I just wanted to, this is a quick excerpt from the 2019 Ontario budget, which is where we launched our Top 10 transaction program. And as you can see, like, this talks about all of the things that we talk about in digital government, about how digital practices can improve the way government works and can make government better. But it is also written in a way that sells it really well for the political side and sells it really well for the public, where they can understand what we're doing, which is this, like, if you are in line at a Service Ontario, it is not efficient for you. You are spending time that you didn't need to spend there, that you could have spent online. And how can we give people and the people and businesses of Ontario their time back? Because every transaction online is one less person in line. And so even if you have to go in line, you still have a better transaction because there's less people in front of you. People can spend more time with each other. So use that to your advantage. So of course, and Ryan mentioned this, and this is so true, like, you get the money, you get the people, it's great, but then what do you do after that? Because there is a whole part of the machinery of government that you do need to set yourself up to in order to sustain momentum and to sustain your funding as well. As I mentioned, you will get sucked into a trap of like reporting and like project plans and all of that. But if you build a system around that, you can make that really easy on the team and create that umbrella where the team can do agile and the team can run their sprints while you're managing the kind of machinery of government part. And so that first point, which I think is really important, we're working with a lot of different ministries, a lot of different partners, a lot of different stakeholders. is that you do have to move at the speed of trust. Digital is a different way of working. It is about the how we work, not necessarily the what we're doing. And so spend the time to bring your ministry partners along, build a governance structure that makes people comfortable, but still allows you to work in an agile way, and use that as a way to start feeding the story and feeding the narrative and feeding the difference that you're making up the chain as well. You'll have to do things a bit more traditionally, and that's okay. Be prepared for change. So since we've launched this program, we've had 3 different ministers. We've had multiple deputies. There is like no stability in government. It's like this false construct that government is a really boring state place. So be prepared for change and be prepared to refresh yourself and refresh your narrative and refresh how you're working and bring those people along again and keep pitching it. Like you're going to have to keep pitching what you're doing, and that's okay too. Which brings me to my final point, which is tell the small stories. One of the great things about digital is that it gives you some really early quick wins that you can talk about and use that as a way to continue to drive people to understand what you're doing, to want to give you hopefully more money and more people, which is what we're ultimately looking for, in order to drive these better services. And so I just want to share, as I wrap up, 2 quick examples for you. So these are both from our Top 10 Transaction program. The top one is from some content changes that we made to Ontario.ca based off of user research. And these show really not just the impact that it has, like, yes, we have a better content, we have a better experience online, but it saves people money in person too. And so after changing them, we were able to reduce calls to our Service Ontario contact centers by 6,000 calls. That's 6,000 fewer people who are calling in. Like, that's huge. Less people on hold, more time for people. It saves people money. Everybody's happier all around. And then on the vehicle renewal side, it was reduced to $1,100 from $2,900. And this is just by content changes. Like, this is a quick win. So as we're feeding these stories, we're able to keep building that momentum. And the bottom one's actually an example of something our lean delivery office did, which worked with accessible parking permits. And we're able to increase productivity by 23%. So these are people who need accessible parking permits. There's a huge backlog of this in Ontario, and they can now process 300 permits more a day. And that was in the first 2 weeks. It's leveled off, but they've been able to maintain that change. It's still over 20% with 200 more permits a day. That's a huge story, and that's within the first 6 months of the project. That's not after a 10-year project. So how can you help these stories to build your case further on? And I am way over time, so I will stop.
Thank you, Katie. I'll now invite all of our presenters up to answer some questions. So we have about 10 minutes. I was to ask an opening question, but I think I'd rather just jump straight to the room.
So the potential exists. At this point in time, the city has not released all of the data simply because it's we're still installing. I have asked these questions because I believe the potential is massive in this data set, right? So it's not available yet, but it will be. So location, first of all, right? So as I said, I think there's almost 1 million once the installation is complete, locations. So if we can then share the locations, they're all networked, what can we then do with that? I think there's been some discussion, and there's actually a pilot that we're just working on, in particular in the market in Ottawa, around can we dim the lights, for example, at certain times of day? Can we use them as a signal, or in the case of emergency, for example? So I think there's a ton of potential. We're getting really close. Not quite there yet, though.
Another question? Yes.
Okay. So the question was around, agile is premised on this notion of failing fast, right? And bureaucracy doesn't like to fail. So here's the dirty little secret, right? Government fails all the time, right? But they fail huge, and they fail in a way where no individual person is accountable for that, right? And not to poke at any of my former colleagues from the federal government, but I mean, Phoenix is kind of this classic elephant in the room right now that everybody's looking at, and it's a great example of how not to be agile in terms of how it was rolled out. And the challenge of our traditional way of, I think, approaching these things in government is government takes on huge amounts of risk, right, in terms of the way it does traditional project management, but that risk doesn't get internalized in the project itself. And so, in the training work that I'm doing right now with government executives, a lot of what we're trying to get people to realize is this notion of that you're absolutely going to have things that don't work, right? If you aren't having some degree of revisiting your assumptions, then you're not challenging your assumptions hard enough. But it's being able to build that into a process that lets you do it very quickly and fast in a way that it actually de-risks the project overall. But the big challenge I think that we're up against on this, and goes back to my Pac-Man slide on this, right? Even if you try to do that, our systems of budgeting and approvals aren't set up for that right now. And I actually think this is going to be one of the existential issues that governments are going to have to cross in the next few years, is we can't rely on processes and structures that are decades, if not centuries old, and expect us to be able to work in agile in different ways. At some point, that's going to have to be addressed to get there.
That's a great answer and a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. In my experience, we spend a lot of time trying to do waterfall and falling on our faces, right? So Phoenix, $957 million. We've got our own Made in BC scandal of the same kind of nature, not quite as big, but and it's like, come on, guys, let's not waste these crises, right? This is such a wonderful burning platform for us to really adopt new ways of working. When I came into the government of Canada, like Jenna, I've got a background in economics, and so I came in as a baby economist, and they tell me how government works, and they're like, these twin funnels, and you start with this big, all these possibilities, and you narrow, and then there's this moment of political purity, and that's the cabinet deliberation, and then you roll it out, and then you go and you're sort of supporting these discussions. And one of my first big projects, it was $1.3 billion major technology project, firm fixed price contract, 8 years. Sorry, you think anybody knows what's going to be happening in the world 8 years from now? That's just chaos. It makes no sense. And so today, you contrast that with what we're doing in BC. The BC Developers Exchange is fully agile. We've trained 3,000 of our 35,000 public servants in agile. The big caveat that I would put on that is you can't just call yourself agile, right? And so we do all of our projects that come through the lab, we do alignment sessions, and it's bonkers. You've got these deputies and ADMs that are coming in, they're doing the alignment session, and we say, hey, if you want to influence the project, great, you come to the sprint review, right? And so the first sprint review where they come and they're like, that sounds great, but do this. And you're like, sure, we'll put it on the backlog. And they're like, what? No, do it now. I'm the boss. And you're like, we will triage it, we'll put it on the backlog. And that sort of cultural piece is really challenging. So yeah, it's important to have the courage to ship code early and often, but it's also critical, I would argue, in a public sector context, to have the discipline to impose on ourselves the upskilling, the culture, the institutionality to make it possible to be successful in adopting Agile. Great question, though.
Just to build on that a little bit in terms of talking about failure, and when you realize you've gone down a path and it maybe wasn't the way to go, is to bring the evidence with you when you're talking to decision makers. So build the context ahead of time so they're used to things like user research. So for example, our top 10 transaction program, we have had our minister's office observe user research sessions. We have had other ministers' offices observe user research sessions. We have all senior leaders who are part of the project observe them. And if you go, the product manager for the program is talking this afternoon, and I encourage you to hear her talk because she's amazing. But we have preconditioned them for the idea that you are going to learn things throughout this process, so that when we go and say, like, hey, this didn't work, and here is the evidence as to why. Here's the data that's showing why this has failed, or why we need to take a different approach, or why we are shifting the way we're working, or shifting what we're going to do for this project, because we've seen it in user research, because we've seen it through our data analytics, and they are familiar with what that is and how that works. It will help you go a long way. You're still, like, government mindset, like it does have a long way to go to change, but you can start building that preconditioning into your project. And that's why, so that when it comes time to do that failure, they're ready for it and they understand what that evidence base that you're bringing them is. And then especially when they see the evidence base, they're like, oh, well, I guess if you say it that way, like it's not just you saying this is a failure and we need to try something new. It is, you have done the user research, you have done the analytics, you know why it is, but you have to, the first time they hear about user research can't be when you go to them and be like, user research says we can't do this. It needs to be before, and you need to bring them along as part of the how you work.
Another question? Yes.
I'm not sure if, hello, thank you for your presentations. And I'm not sure if you were here in the morning and saw the keynote by Ryan Androsoff. I'm just sort of wondering if you could respond to some of the ideas she was putting forward about moving towards more systemic change away from sort of tactical change. And I mean, other than Jenna, I feel all of you have been organizations that have done a lot of tactical change work. What does that look like, and especially for funding? How do you sell that, and how do you measure what happens if it all?
So I'll just for those who didn't hear the question, some examples of moving away from tactical change to a more systemic approach for change.
I'll speak really quickly and then hand it over because I know Ryan and Jaimie have done a lot of work in this space. For me, that is one of the primary jobs of the Ontario Digital Service, is to identify the common barriers that we are seeing across and be the ones to do the hard work to fix that systemic issue in order to make it easier for teams everywhere. That being said, that change is hard and it takes time, and particularly in the funding and procurement space, I've noticed that it is a big process to change. And so part of the work that we're doing is that very thing, is like, how can we work really closely with Treasury Board and start with things like their governance processes and making sure they're asking the right questions about projects and making sure that they're looking at projects in a way that lends them towards steering them in a more digital route. And how can you work with them to bring them along in the process in order for them to understand why the change is necessary? It is the big next phase of digital, I believe, is that like we are doing all of these great things and we are starting to understand exactly where those big systemic issues are. And we have to tackle them, and you need that mandate from the top, which is where people like city councilors are going to be so important, is that like that willingness to change things like how we fund projects, and that you can't actually fund a project. We should be funding teams and products instead. But right now, all that's available is to fund projects, and so take advantage of that while you can, and then hopefully organizations like ours are working with Treasury Board in order to make that happen. But it's a longer game. Like, it is a longer game. It is one of those like foundational things of government that they hold dear to their hearts, and it will take a longer time to work on. But we are making strides. They're just very slow strides, I would say. Same with the procurement space. Getting more rules around agile procurement is also, like, you see those individual kind of examples, but that systemic level shift towards it has been a little bit slower. But I do think a lot of behind the scenes work is happening to bring people along on that journey.
Great question. I've been in my organization for 6 months. Got there's probably 50, 60 people who really get it, like the digital warriors. I've got 35,000 people that we could be potentially bring along on this ride. So really pivoting from the bright, shiny lights of being a digital champion to being just, this is the way we work, that's so critical. It is not sexy. All the stuff that I was talking about today, that's fun. The less fun part, changing the laws. You know, we changed our law in November because before that, we had a law within our privacy legislation preventing any kind of extrajurisdictional temporary processing. So no cloud for BC. We had no cloud because of a law. So you go and you're doing that legislative analysis and you're going and you're tabling in the House. That's not going to get you a bunch of tweets. That's not going to get you love from the community, right? Same thing. We've got a mandatory policy that hasn't been updated in over 15 years. It's our core policies and procedure manual, chapter 12 on IM and IT. The thing is mercilessly out of date. And so we've got a team that's updating that thing, and they aren't getting a lot of love because they're policy wonks. But that's what's going to take this from being a little bright moment in time to a way of working. And, in trade negotiations, that was one of the jobs that I had. We always talked about ratcheting, right? And so you ratchet the negotiation so that anything that you've gained, you can't go back behind that point. And so you have to embody these things in legislation, in policies. You have to change the ways of working, right? So we do this by taking some aspirational things. I have no illusions. Our digital principles are nothing other than aspiration. But now we're doing the hard work of taking them to Treasury Board and putting them as a mandatory policy, right? And so any of these things, let's dream in Technicolor, and then let's have the discipline of following up behind and make sure that we bring the town along with us.
So, Ryan, after this, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I'm just going to say two very quick things on this, 'cause I think it's an important question. So one, I think teams like CDS or the Ontario Digital Service or Jaimie's team in BC, those tactical actions are part of the systemic in that they help people see what's in the realm of the possible. And I think it's tough to go from kind of 0 to 100 overnight, right? You've got to give people those examples of what the new looks like. And even though, a CDS can't change everything the federal government does, the theory is always those handful of examples help fuel the conversation for the bigger change. But the other piece I want to leave you all with is I really increasingly think that for these systemic changes to happen, we need pressure from outside of the public service itself. I'm glad Jenna's here because we need the elected officials on board with this. But frankly, we need civic tech communities and others to be lobbying government. I mean, we need a bit of a political revolution around this because the reality is that the decision makers in government who are part of the status quo, not through any kind of ill will on their part, but it's tough if somebody has spent 25 years in a certain way of doing things to suddenly expect them overnight to change the whole system. And most systemic change that we see happen in institutions comes from outside pressure. So I think that's one of the things that groups like Code for Canada and the civic tech movement more broadly can play a really important role on, is where we see that government has to change laws and policies. I think folks like Jenna need the air cover from citizens and organizations to be saying publicly, these are the changes we need to see happen, because there's a limit to what you can do from inside the system. You need folks on the outside pushing on this as well.
Thank you very much to our panel.